What does it mean to try to fix the economy? Well, that's what we're going to try to find out in this video. Welcome to Bonkers Economics. This is where we use these images I've created to try to unpack some of the issues in the UK economy. And this is episode 0, if you like, of my new series called Fixing the Economy. And it's episode 0 because it's actually really an introduction. It's just an introduction to what the series is going to be about. And it's a sort of setting the picture, setting the frame for what we're going to be talking about during the course of the coming year. So what we've got coming up over the course of this year will be a new episode every 2 weeks in a series of videos that's designed to build up as a sort of sequence, which will unpack the whole question of what's not working at a sort of deep level in the economy, how the system is not working, and the sort of changes we need to make if we want to fix it. So it's just simply called Fixing the Economy, but it's going to go into a very broad and deep analysis of the sort of issues that we are facing. So I just want to put a bit of context around that, because change, economic, political change, it's actually incredibly difficult. And we haven't had a really significant, so to speak, change of direction in the UK or even the global economy now since the 1980s. So in 1979, Margaret Thatcher came to power, and she did embark upon a significant realignment, if you like, of the way that the economy was understood to be working. And that coincided with the beginnings of globalization and the opening up of China and the Far East and all these cheap goods being available that could be bought much more cheaply there than could be produced at home. And the entire economy is sort of being reframed as a sort of services economy rather than a production economy. An economy that relied upon turning money over and making a margin out of activities rather than sort of producing real things. And the manufacturing element of the economy took a big hit during the 1980s and subsequently, and the entire thing was sort of shifted into more of a financial type economy. Everything was financialized, if you like, over a period of time. So, for example, the privatisation that took place, the privatisation of water, electricity, gas, all those things, those privatisations were a way of saying, look, this is not really about providing water or providing electricity or providing gas. These are businesses, and what we need to do is attract capital investment into those businesses, and if they're run as businesses, they will do much better. That was the sort of theory. Whereas the state running these as public services was considered to be inefficient and overly expensive and not likely to be as successful. Well, we sort of know how that turned out in relation to water, at least, because the water industry in England is now a complete mess. But there was nonetheless a lot of support at that time for these sorts of changes, because there was a feeling that what had been going on up to that point hadn't really been working. And that's sort of where we are now. We've got to a place where this neoliberal economic system we've had for the last 40 years or so is not really working. And frankly, it hasn't been working since 2008 and probably before that. But certainly since the big financial crash, we haven't got it back on track. And because we haven't got it back on track, all sorts of other things have come into play. So, for example, we've had this rise in nationalism. We've had this polarization between people's views about things like the European Union and all sorts of things like that. It's become increasingly difficult to have sort of coherent, interest-based, rational discussions about politics because everybody seems to be divided on one side of the conversation or another and not willing to try to combine their energies to find a way forward. And that's an indication that we've reached a sort of impasse. We've reached a place where some significant underlying structural change in the economy and in the way society organized is needed. And that's not just in the UK, that would be true in the US, it would be true in Europe, it's true in a sense across the global economy. We just need to do things differently. We need an alteration, a shift, if you like, in the framing of the economy so that it just sort of works on different principles rather than the way that we had in the 1980s. And that's not an easy thing to do. But what you do have to do, if you want that to happen, is you need to prepare the ground. You need to have something ready to replace what's not working. You need to have worked out a system that might work better. You need to get people on board and understanding what that system looks like. And there's been a lot of energy gone into this over the last 40 years, and it hasn't really found traction. And what it's tended to do is to sort of splinter up into different people campaigning for different things. So, for example, I've got enormous admiration for Gary Stevenson, Gary's Economics. He's done a huge job on YouTube, on his channel, in raising awareness and interest around, for example, taxing the wealthy. Tax wealth, not work, as he says. And that captures a really important principle about the economy, which is that the economy has become all about the accumulation of wealth and not about the production of real value, of real wealth, of real stuff, if you like, that people could make if they had access to the money to finance their activities. So he's not wrong about the sort of big picture by any means. In fact, he's spot on. But we also know pretty much that taxing the wealth of the very rich is extremely hard. And even if you look at some of the more radical proposals for wealth taxes, for example, from the Green Party or wherever it might be, then you're only talking about a few tens of billions of pounds every year in additional taxation, and that is very, very hard to do as well. So it's not probably going to fix things just to say, here's a solution, we'll tax the rich and that will fix everything else, because it won't, and I think we all know that. I think it's just that it's a thing we can hang on to, it's a principle, it's an idea which reflects what's going wrong but doesn't actually necessarily solve it. So that's the sort of thing we've seen over the last 20, 30 years. It's been people focusing on different bits of the thing that don't work, focusing on different solutions. What we haven't really had is the sort of big picture looking at the thing and saying, hang on, what's the sort of fundamental thing that's not working here? Why is it the thing needs all these solutions? What is it that's collectively, as it were, causing all these problems to arise? What are the major structural changes that could make the situation so much better? So those are the issues we're going to be looking at in Bonkers Economics. So as I say, over the next few months, every 2 weeks, there'll be a new video coming out and they'll be sequential. They will build up to a sort of full picture across the course of the year, and there will be solutions, there will be ideas, and there will be an attempt to reframe the way in which the economy operates so that we can see that by doing it differently in the way that we started to do it differently 40 years ago, we can project for ourselves a better future and a more successful and more sustainable economy going forward. That's what we're going to be doing. And just a quick word about myself, because you might wonder, well, who am I to talk about this? Well, the answer is, well, I'm nobody, but I have had a life in business. I've written a lot about economics. I've also been a builder. If you recognize me, you might possibly have seen me on Grand Designs back in the day. So I know a bit about solving problems. My real interest is in looking at things saying, hey, that's not working. How do we fix that? But I'm not an academic economist. I don't claim to be. I'm glad I'm not an academic economist, because most economic training these days is rooted in principles that frankly are seriously out of date. There are, of course, economists working in a much more enlightened and much more forward-looking and progressive way, but nonetheless the basic training you're going to get as an economist these days is still somewhat stuck in the 1950s. So it's important that we don't worry too much about the, so to speak, the level of expertise that's coming to this. Because what I want to say is that we're all economists. We live our lives in an economic way. We all produce wealth. We all cook meals for each other. We all do things which are economic. We know what it is to create wealth in our lives. And we can see what's not working by looking with our eyes. We only have to look and observe and experience and think about what we see in order to understand some of the things that are going wrong. So going back to these images are to encourage us to look. They're saying, hey, look at that thing. That's crazy. That's bonkers. That's not working. How come it's like that? It allows us to look at some of the granular detail, if you like, of what's going on, and then begin to see how that forms a pattern. Because all these images, and there will be more coming along as well, there are about 12 or 16 of them here, but there are plenty more coming down the line, and all these images, they work together to create a sort of bigger picture of what's going on. And that's what we'll be looking at over the next few weeks and months, as I say. So I look forward to you joining me on that journey. It'll be every 2 weeks, but also in between, I'll continue to do regular shorter videos on what's going on in the economy week by week. So I will be publishing new videos every week, but every 2 weeks on a Monday, there'll be a slightly longer video in this series, Fixing the Economy, in which we will begin to build up a picture of how things can change. So thanks for listening, and do please press that famous like button if you've enjoyed this video, because that would be really helpful, and do subscribe if you haven't, and thank you if you have. And please do check out the website at bonkerseconomics.net. And finally, if you want to buy postcards of these images, well, you can do that now. There are sets of 16, they're available on the website, and they do make quite good sort of conversation openers if you hand them around with your family and friends. Thanks very much.